Okay, page 3. Now we're doing the entire completing the square process, and like I told you before, you don't have to do this unless you really, really want to, because we have so many alternatives, right? Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check out the b term and see what the magic number would be that I need to add. So negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. Square negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. So what I would really like to have is positive 4 added to the first two terms. And I'm going to immediately subtract negative 4. I'm going to put negative 4 to counteract the fact that I added a plus 4 out of nowhere. Okay. Now I can group these together, and I can group these together. And so basically I can take the square root of this. It would be x minus 2 squared, right? Because x minus 2 quantity squared is equal to x squared minus 4x plus 4. That's the whole reason why we added this magic number plus 4 here. And then I am going to combine these into a negative 3. And then I can add it to the other side. And now I'm going to solve for x. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides like I did on the previous page. I'll get x equals 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 3. And then I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and I'll get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 3. Okay, and I'm done. Now let's do this one for c. Okay, so remember, for completing the square, the first step is we put the first two terms, and then we leave a space, and then we put plus 46 way to the right equals 0. Sometimes the right side is equals y. And then we're going to figure out what the magic number is. Negative 14 divided by 2 is negative 7. Negative 7 quantity squared is 49, so plus 49. And then we immediately subtract out 49 so that these two add up to 0. Now I'm going to group these, and I'm going to group these. So the left side, x squared minus 14x plus 49, I can factor that into x minus 7 times x minus 7. So it's equal to x minus 7 squared, right? And then minus 49 plus 46 becomes minus 3 equals 0. Now I'm going to solve for x. So I add 3 to both sides. I get x minus 7 quantity squared equals 3. Now I square root both sides. X minus 7 equals plus or minus the square root of 3. Now I add 7 to both sides. X equals 7 plus or minus the square root of 3. Let's do g. So in this particular case, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put everything on the left side so we can see what the quadratic looks like. I'm going to leave a big space between 6x and plus 2, so I have space to put in my magic numbers. 6x, the b value is 6. I'm going to divide it by 2. I get 3, and I square it, and I get 9. And then I immediately subtract the 9 so that I am introducing basically plus 0, right? Now I'm going to group these three terms, and then also I group these two terms. And so the first three terms, x squared plus 6x plus 9, I can factor that into x plus 3 times x plus 3. And then minus 9 plus 2, I can group those together. It gives me minus 7 equals 0. Did you notice that the way you can get this number 3 here is just by taking b and doing the first step to find the magic number? You divide it by 2 and you get positive 3. That's the first step to find the magic number. It is the only step you need to find the value that you're adding to x in the binomial. Now I'm going to add 7 to both sides. So we get that. I'm isolating the x, so I'm moving everything to the other side. To undo square, I need to square root both sides, so I get x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. Now I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. I get x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 7. Okay. Now, remember how I said there's many alternatives to what we're doing here? You could do quadratic formula. Right? Once you get into this position here, a equals 1, b equals 6, c equals 7, you can use quadratic formula to solve these instead of doing what we're doing, the algebra. Actually, the way you derive quadratic formula is you start out with ax squared plus bx plus c, and you do this exact procedure on it. Okay? That's why it looks so much like quadratic formula here. Okay. So, First thing we're going to do here is we're going to write x squared plus 6x with a big space, and then plus 7 equals 0. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take the b value 6, we're going to divide it by 2, we get 3, and then we square it. Then we group x squared plus 6x plus 9, and we group these two. And then so we take the left 3 terms, and we find out that it's x plus 3 quantity squared, right? We factor it. Then we find out that negative 9 plus 7 is minus 2 equals 0. Now we're going to solve for x to figure out what x is. And so the thing that's being done on the outside is minus 2, so we're going to add 2 to both sides. We get x plus 3 quantity squared equals 2. Now we're going to square root both sides. X plus 3 equals square root of 2, plus or minus. Now we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. And we're done. Okay. Next step. We got x squared plus 6x equals negative 11. First thing, let's move everything to the left side. Let's leave a space, though, to put in our magic number. B value is 6. Let's divide. That's a terrible plus sign. B value is 6. Let's divide it by 2. We get 3. We square it. We get plus 9. And we immediately subtract minus 9 so that we are basically adding 0. And then we group these two together. And then we take this, we factor out the left trinomial. We get x plus 3 squared. We add negative 9 and 11. We get plus 2. Now we are going to subtract 2 from both sides, and then we'll get x plus 3 quantity squared equals negative 2. And let's square root both sides. We'll get x plus 3 equals plus or minus square root of negative 2. And now let's subtract 3 from both sides. So we get x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 2. Now, square root of negative 2 does not exist in the real world. It's called an imaginary number. So actually, this solution we got is a complex number. It's part imaginary, part real. In that case, and for this class, you could just say no real solutions, okay? You don't have to continue on. Once you figure out that inside the square root sign there is going to be a negative discriminant, we know that there is no real solution. And in this class, we do not cover the complex or imaginary solution case. All right, last 3 for number 3. So, they gave us some with a values that are not 1. So let's do the first one. Now, if you use the technique that we talked about before, this is just slightly harder, but it's still possible to do. First thing we're going to do is we're going to separate out this part and this part. So we're going to put a little space in between the two, just like we did before. But we got one extra step. Our extra step is we're going to factor out the a. Okay, and we're going to factor out the a out of the first 2 terms, but not out of the last term. The last term, we just leave it alone outside the parentheses. Our magic number, we're going to put inside the parentheses. We're going to put plus 1, because if we take the b value of 2, we divide it by 2, we get 1, and then we square it, we get plus 1. We are immediately going to subtract out the minus 1, so that in effect we're adding 0. Now what we're going to do is we are going to write down, we're going to factor that part. Okay, and then we're going to leave this part separate, except, do you see how the 2 is multiplied times every single one of these values underlined here? So we're going to put 2x squared plus 2x plus 1 is the first term. Second term, we're going to have 2 times 1, that's this, times 2, plus 1 equals 0. Now let's factor that. So it would be 2, the a value, x plus 1 quantity squared, minus 2 plus 1. So I multiplied that out. Now I have these two added together. It's negative 1. Now, it's just like before. I'm going to isolate the x. And so the outside function that's being done is minus 1. So we're going to add 1 both sides. So we get 2x plus 1 quantity squared equals 1. I'm going to divide both sides by 2 because there's a 2 here multiplied. So I get x plus 1 squared equals 1/2. I'm going to square root both sides, so I'm going to get x plus 1 on the left, and I'm going to have plus or minus the square root of 1/2 on the right. And then I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides, so I'm going to have minus 1 plus or minus the square root of 1/2. Okay? You could also write square root of 1/2 as 1 over square root of 2, or square root of 2 over 2, and if you don't know how to get there, that's okay. It's not in the scope of this class. Square root of 1/2 is just fine. E. So we have a 5 there, and remember, first thing we're going to do is we're going to split this apart and leave a space in between so that we can write our magic numbers in between. Okay? And now the next step is we're going to factor out the a value. Now we're going to put in the magic number. So if we divide -3 by 2, we get -1.5. If we square -1.5, we get plus 2.25. So we'll add 2.25 and we'll subtract 2.25 immediately so that we're basically adding 0. Now we're going to group together just the first 3 terms in the parentheses, and we are going to factor that. And then the 5 is going to be distributed to the second term also. So first we're going to put 5, and then we're going to factor that. So we get x plus half of 3, which is it's negative 1.5, right? Because it's -3, half of -3 is -1.5. Negative 1.5 is quantity squared. And then we have minus 5 times 2.25 plus 2 equals 0. -5 times 2.25, let's see what that is. That would be -10 and -1.25. So it would be negative 11.25. Is that right? Yeah. Plus 2. Negative 11.25 plus 2, that's negative 9.25. And this is the same. This is the same. And then I'm going to add 9.25 to both sides. So I get 5x minus 1.5 quantity squared equals, I'm going to add 9.25 to both sides, 9.25. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 5. And I'll get something terrible. 9/5 plus 0.05. So that would be 1.8 plus 0.05, which would be 1.85. Then we're going to take the square root of both sides. So x minus 1.5 equals plus or minus the square root of 1.85. Then I can add 1.5 to both sides. So I get x equals 1.5 plus or minus the square root of 1.85. Okay? And I think I'm done. Okay, C. Again, first thing, you're going to split these apart. So we put 3x squared plus 12x, leave a big space, plus 5 equals 0. Now we're going to factor out the 3 from the first 2 terms. So we get 3x squared plus 4x, big space, plus 5 equals 0. In the big space, we're going to put the magic number. So we take plus 4, we divide by 2, we get 2. We square it, we get 4 again. We immediately subtract 4 out. Now we have x squared plus 4x plus 4. We can factor that into x plus 2 quantity squared. Then the next term, we're gonna distribute that 3 to the -4. We get -12 plus 5 equals 0. Then we're going to group these together. We get -7. Now I'm going to solve for x. So I'm going to add 7 to both sides. 3x plus 2 squared equals 7. Now I'm going to divide both sides by 3 because that's the last thing done here. So I get x plus 2 quantity squared equals 7/3. Then I take the square root of both sides. X plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 7/3. Now I subtract 2 from both sides. I get x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 7/3. And I'm done.